Hey guys, tonight we step into the dim, unsettling shadow of a year so peculiar, so thoroughly uncooperative, that even the peasants of the Dark Ages, people who routinely endured hardship, hunger, and horror, paused and looked skyward, unnerved. They didn't need books or scientists to tell them something was wrong. They felt it in their bones, in the soil, in the sun that no longer burned the way it should. Before we get started, take a moment, if you enjoy journeys like these, to support the story by subscribing, and drop a note below to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always eerie to imagine this story unfolding across time zones and across centuries. Now, settle in. Dim the lights. Let the hum of your surroundings become the distant breath of a world long gone. And let us step back to the early 6th century. Picture yourself in that world. You might be a wandering monk, a lowly scribe with ink-stained fingers, or a farmer quietly hoping the turnips will be kinder this year. Your life is simple, not easy, but known. The sun rises and falls as it always has. The seasons turn. You plant, you harvest, you live as your father did, and his father before him. Until one day, something shifts. At first, it's subtle, just a strange heaviness in the air. The morning skies wear a veil of ash grey. A haze lingers where the bright blue should be. The birds seem slower, quieter. You squint into the light, confused. The elders mutter. The priest says nothing, which is worse than words. The sun is still there, technically, but its warmth has fled. Its brilliance has dulled. He floats above like a tired ghost of its former self, casting a pale, blue-tinged light that brings no comfort, no heat, no reassurance. Weeks pass. The sky refuses to clear. The light remains sickly and thin, like candlelight seen through fogged glass. Crops that once burst green and golden with the promise of life now stand stubborn, stunted, unsure whether to bloom or wither. In some places, trees simply stop growing. Leaves curl inward, flowers never open. And as the days blur together, each one grayer and colder than the last, a whisper rises among the people. Something is broken. Historians would later describe it with eerie restraint. Procopius, a scholar not known for embellishment, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness. But what does that mean to those who lived it? It meant that noon looked like dusk, and dusk looked like the end of the world. In China, men looked up from their rice paddies and saw stars. In daylight. In Ireland, monks noted that the bread had failed. Not the grain, not the harvest, the bread. When bread itself, the most sacred of foods, becomes scarce, you don't need a prophet to tell you something terrible is coming. This was not mist. This was not rain. This was a fog without source or scent, a dry and unnatural shroud that draped itself over the world like a death veil. It did not blow away with the wind, nor was it scattered by storms. It simply lingered, everywhere. Across continents, from the mountains of Mesopotamia to the coastlines of Europe, a shared bewilderment took hold. Farmers stopped tilling. Scribes stopped writing. Animals wandered in circles. And the sky, the one constant in a fragile world, had suddenly gone quiet. Naturally, people turned to the divine. What else could explain the silence of the heavens? Some said it was God's wrath. Others blamed witches, or eclipses, or neighboring villages they never trusted to begin with. Superstition bloomed where science had yet to tread. Rumors spread like wildfire, even though no fires burned. The fog muted even that. But beneath the fear, beneath the frantic explanations, one truth gnawed at every soul. No one knew how long this would last. A day, a week, a year. No one could say. And so the people waited, in a twilight world where the sun no longer warmed and the stars dared to shine at noon. This was the year 536, and it was only just beginning. By now, the sun had become a stranger. It still rose, yes, but only as a formality, as if it had grown weary of its duties. It loitered behind a veil of grey, its face dulled and expressionless. The world, once painted in the warm hues of dawn and dusk, now existed in a state of permanent twilight. People awoke and couldn't tell whether it was morning or merely a darker shade of night. At midday, there was barely enough light to read by. And at sunset, there was no sunset. Just a slow, indifferent dimming, like the gods themselves were pulling a curtain closed without ceremony. From the bustling streets of Constantinople to the quiet hills of Ireland, the observations were disturbingly similar. Travelers described the sky as a wash of pale blue, devoid of shadow. Children looked for their own silhouettes and found none. There is something deeply unsettling about standing under a sun that casts no shadow, as if the laws of nature, those ancient promises between the earth and the sky, had been revoked without notice. In China, things grew stranger still. People reported stars, not in the evening, not at dawn, but in the middle of the day. Constellations glittering faintly above their heads while they stood barefoot in rice fields. Imagine tending your crops and looking up to see Orion mocking you from a daytime sky. This wasn't bad weather. This was something deeper, a reset, a misfire. The world no longer obeyed itself. And the cold, oh, the cold, arrived like a thief. Not the crisp chill of autumn or the biting winds of January, but something more confusing, more insidious. Spring came, but warmth did not. Summer arrived, but the air refused to thaw. Crops that should have been thriving stood still in the dirt, confused and stunted. Wheat curled back into the ground. Barley wilted before it could ripen. Grapes refused to swell. In some places, farmers simply stopped planting. What was the point? The land had forgotten how to grow. To us, the explanation seems simple. A volcano, or perhaps more than one, had erupted somewhere, far away, perhaps in Iceland or deep in the tropics. It had sent plumes of ash and sulfur high into the stratosphere where the wind could not carry them away. That ash spread across the globe, forming a thin, invisible shield that blunted the sun's heat, dimmed its light, and dropped global temperatures like a stone into a frozen pond. But the people of 536 knew nothing of volcanology. They had no concept of tectonic plates or atmospheric chemistry. They only knew that the sun, that old, reliable beacon, had grown pale and distant, and with it, the world was wilting. As the earth grew dim, so too did its rhythm. Crops failed, yes, but so did time itself. The calendar lost its power. Rituals that once relied on the movement of the heavens were thrown into chaos. When is it time to plant? When the spring feels like winter? When is the harvest? When the fields yield nothing? Whole villages lived in a kind of suspended dread, waiting for the return of a sky that no longer kept its promises. In Constantinople, the historian Procopius kept writing. His words, usually dry and formal, cracked with fear. "The sun," he wrote, "gave forth its light without brightness." That was not a metaphor. That was a diagnosis. The planet was sick, and no one knew the cure. In the east, reports grew more surreal. Snow fell in summer. Dust blew in from nowhere. Yellow ash rained from the skies. In China, summer frost killed off entire harvests overnight. Chickens laid no eggs. Goats gave no milk. Livestock wandered and died. The Irish annals spoke of the failure of bread, a poetic phrase that disguised a brutal truth. Famine. Real and terrible famine. And still, the fog did not lift. The dry haze clung to the world like a ghost. It had no weight, no smell. It didn't sting the eyes or fill the lungs like smoke. It didn't dance on the water like mist. It just hung there, dull, unmoving, and merciless. Years later, scientists would discover traces of this cataclysm frozen in ice, literal fingerprints of the Earth's tantrum trapped in glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, sulfur spikes, ash deposits, a record of the sky's silence. But in 536, there was no such knowledge, only the gnawing cold, the stunted fields, and the silent sun. This was not a storm to endure. This was a new reality to survive, and survival, as it turned out, would become the only goal. There comes a moment in any prolonged crisis when people stop asking why, and simply start enduring. By the time the eerie haze of 536 had settled fully over the world, most had given up trying to explain it. There were no omens left to interpret, no priests whose prayers changed the skies, no merchants whose goods brought relief. The strange twilight became the new daylight. The absence of seasons became normal. Hope began to feel like a childish memory. But the earth wasn't done. If 536 was the opening act of a cruel epic, the following years were the main performance. In the high places of the world, on volcanic slopes and fault lines stretching from the Arctic to the Pacific, nature stirred again. It did not roar, it did not warn, it simply ruptured. Another volcano, or perhaps two more, erupted in a span of years, each one pouring more ash into an already wounded sky. The veil darkened further. The cold deepened. What might have been a temporary misfortune transformed into an era. Historians today believe there were at least 3 major volcanic eruptions between 536 and 547, each compounding the damage of the last. These were no mere local disasters. They were planetary-scale eruptions. Global ash injections, each one a brutal sulfuric punctuation mark on a decade of despair, and the world responded as any living organism would, by shutting down. Rivers slowed. Rainfall stopped. Whole ecosystems faltered. Birds flew in confused loops, unable to sense the seasons. Forests thinned. Some species vanished. Even the insects seemed to retreat. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Humans, meanwhile, did what humans have always done. They broke. Across Europe and Asia, the agricultural systems that supported life collapsed. Barley shriveled. Grapes withered on the vine. Wheat failed to sprout. Hunger spread like a second fog, more intimate and far more cruel. And with hunger came its old companion, disease. Famine weakens bodies. Weak bodies invite sickness. And into this fragile, frightened world crept an invisible killer, plague. In the Byzantine Empire, just a few years after the skies went dark, the Black Death's older cousin, the bubonic plague, made its first recorded appearance. It traveled by ship, nestled in the bellies of rats and the bite of fleas, and it moved with terrifying speed. In Constantinople, bread lines turned into funeral processions. The dead were buried in mass graves. The sick died within days, sometimes hours. Estimates vary, but some suggest as much as half of the empire's population vanished in the span of a few seasons. The emperor himself, Justinian, caught the disease and barely survived. His empire, already battered by cold and hunger, staggered beneath the weight of death. And through it all, the sun stayed dim. The people of this time did not understand atmospheric circulation or bacterial infection. They saw a sky that no longer lit the earth, a land that no longer fed them, and a sickness that stole their neighbors in silence. What choice did they have but to believe in wrath, in punishment, in some cosmic betrayal? Villagers turned on one another. Cities turned to superstition. Prophets sprang up in town squares, preaching doom or redemption. Some claimed angels had fallen. Others said demons had risen. Some simply stopped speaking altogether. What was the point when your gods no longer answered and your fields no longer grew? Trade routes failed. Economies crumbled. Gold meant nothing when bread could not be found. In some towns, people sold their children to buy food. In others, they ate the bark from trees or the bones of the dead, ground into powder and mixed with water. Cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, was whispered about in distant corners of the world. And yet somehow, through all this, people endured. The resilience of the human species is not always noble. Sometimes it is brutal. Sometimes it is numb, but it is enduring. In 536, and in the years that followed, survival became a daily prayer, a ritual of grit and desperation. To live through that time was to exist in a long winter without end, a dusk that stretched for a decade, a world that had forgotten light. They didn't know the term volcanic winter. They didn't know what had caused the sky to betray them, but they felt it in their marrow, that something had broken. And they feared, most of all, that it might never be fixed. The years dragged on, not in the way normal time passes, but in a stretched and distorted crawl, as if the calendar itself had lost its rhythm. By 537, the world had not returned to normal. In fact, the very idea of normal had begun to disintegrate. People watched the horizon each morning not with hope, but with suspicion. Would the sun return today? Would the fields thaw? Would the clouds part and reveal the blue sky that once meant life? It rarely did. Across continents, the seasons grew indistinct. Spring was no longer a rebirth, but a pale imitation, offering only false promises. Summer was brief and grey. Autumn came early, if it came at all. Winter, on the other hand, lingered. It hung on like a jealous god, refusing to leave. The frost came too soon, the snow too deep. Rivers that once flowed freely now moved sluggishly or froze entirely. In villages scattered from the hills of Gaul to the rice fields of the Yangtze, farmers no longer asked, "When do we plant?" but rather, "Do we bother?" The soil had turned stubborn. What little grew did so slowly, weakly, and often not at all. Entire regions became graveyards of wasted effort, furrowed earth and rotted seeds. Even trees, those stoic sentinels of the natural world, struggled to grow. In Scandinavia, tree rings from that era are narrow, cramped, frozen testimony that something had gone terribly wrong. Trees live through storms, floods, droughts, but in the years following 536, even they seemed to shrink back from life. They grew like prisoners in a cage, and where nature retreated, humanity suffered. The hunger became generational. Children born into these years never knew the taste of a full meal. They came into a world of grey skies and thin broth, where bread was rare and meat a fantasy. In Ireland, the monks recorded it in their strange, poetic way: the failure of bread. 4 words, and behind them the slow, grinding death of whole communities. Those words echoed through time. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty faltered beneath the weight of failed harvests and rising unrest. Yellow dust fell from the sky like cursed snow. In Korea, summer frosts wiped out entire rice harvests. In Britain, populations declined in patterns we can still trace through abandoned settlements and gaps in the archaeological record. Even the mighty Byzantine Empire, the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, found itself shaken. Grain from Egypt failed to arrive. The city of Constantinople, fed by centuries of conquest and trade, now found its bread lines growing longer than its prayer lines. And then came plague, as if summoned by the very despair that gripped the land. Everywhere, the rules broke down. What once seemed reliable, the sun, the seasons, the price of grain, could no longer be trusted. And when trust in nature falters, civilization begins to unravel. Communities turned inward. Cities became suspicious. Foreigners were blamed, along with sinners, sorcerers, and anyone whose face seemed unfamiliar. It was a slow spiral into darkness. Not just the literal twilight of the skies, but the spiritual dimming of humanity's shared faith in the world. Hope was no longer a steady flame. It was a flickering candle behind shuttered windows, and yet, amid the dread and the dying, there were still moments, fragile, uncertain, where people tried to keep going. A sprout breaking through the soil brought not celebration, but stunned silence. Was this real? Could something still grow? A single surviving calf became a community's future. A handful of oats meant another week. Even the smallest signs of life became sacred. But the worst part wasn't the cold. It wasn't even the hunger. It was the waiting, the not knowing, the sense that time itself had turned against you, that the wheel of the year had jammed and the sun had lost its way. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a test of endurance that few would pass. As the years of ash and silence dragged on, something more insidious began to take root, not just in the soil, but in the human mind. It started with uncertainty, then came fear, but in time, fear gave way to exhaustion, and exhaustion to something even darker: detachment. People stopped asking if the sun would return. They stopped watching the sky with desperate prayers. They simply endured, hollow-eyed, as each day bled into the next without light or rhythm. In this dimmed world, famine became routine. The thinned ranks of laborers trudged through fields that refused to yield. Children born in these years were often born into grief, swaddled in rags, their lullabies the murmurs of mourning. Parents who once dreamed of futures now whispered only of survival, of finding food, of avoiding sickness, of making it through another gray morning. But when food grows scarce and the sun hides too long, it is not just bodies that starve. The very structure of society begins to collapse. Order gave way to desperation. Coins lost meaning. Gold, for all its shine, could not be eaten. The real wealth became whatever was edible: a root, a seed, a crust of bread. Bartering returned, not as a quaint tradition, but as a brutal necessity. A carrot might be traded for a tool, a turnip might buy mercy, and if you had food and no children, you were rich, and very much at risk. In Constantinople, even the noble elite began to feel the pinch. Grain prices soared beyond reason. Bread, that most common symbol of civilization, became a luxury, a relic of better times. In villages, worse still, starvation didn't come like a storm. It came slowly, day by day, like a quiet drowning. There was no drama, just fading strength, just silence. And with silence came something more dangerous. A breakdown in the shared illusions that held civilization together. Justice wavered. Government stumbled. In places where local leaders remained, they often resorted to cruelty or indifference. In others, they simply vanished, leaving behind vacant halls and unanswered questions. Some taxed more heavily, believing that squeezing their people harder might force food from thin air. Others hoarded, stockpiling grain as their neighbors starved. The aristocracy, those stewards of land and privilege, were often the first to flee when things got grim. Estates were abandoned. Villages left to fend for themselves. Fields, once guarded, were now picked over by survivors with hollow cheeks and sharper knives. The laws, if they still existed, no longer protected. They merely punished, or were ignored entirely. Even morality, long held up as the guiding light of faith and order, began to flicker. People stole, not for greed, but for bread. Violence spiked, not for power, but for soup. If someone in your community had food, they became both a savior and a threat. Rumors spread fast. Accusations came easily. Superstition returned in full force. Some whispered of demons. Others claimed the sky itself had been cursed. A few turned to wandering prophets who promised salvation in exchange for allegiance or blood. And then there were those who simply stopped trying, who disappeared quietly into the woods, the fog, the rivers. Sometimes whole villages were found empty. No signs of struggle, just abandonment, just absence. There was no central record of it all, no news, no coordinated relief, just rumors that the sun had returned in another land, that bread had been baked in a neighboring province, that the world had finally begun to heal. Most of those rumors were false, but people believed them anyway, because belief was the only nourishment left. Civilization didn't collapse in fire or conquest. It didn't vanish in a single battle or plague. It faded, slowly, quietly. Like a mural left in the rain. One layer at a time, the colors ran, the outlines blurred, the meaning lost, until nothing remained but blank walls and hungry ghosts. Historians of the time stopped writing about kings and treaties. They wrote about the sky, about how it still hadn't turned blue, about how the sun still looked sick, about how the world, once full of pattern and promise, now seemed to exist outside of time. In the end, it was not just the earth that dimmed, it was the very idea of progress, of future, of light, and yet they endured. Not because they were strong, but because they had no other choice. When change finally came, it did not arrive with fanfare. There was no trumpet of sunlight, no sudden blue sky to break the spell. Instead, it crept back into the world the way a wounded man limps toward home, slowly, cautiously, as if unsure it would be welcomed. Somewhere in the early 540s, after nearly a decade of darkness, the ash began to lift. The sky, which for years had been a dull canvas of grey and sorrow, grew a little lighter. Not bright, not yet, but no longer suffocating. People noticed, not with celebration, but with confusion. A bird sang in the morning, a flower bloomed early, a shadow appeared on the ground, faint and flickering. It was as if the world were remembering itself. Shyly, one breath at a time. Farmers, too exhausted to hope, planted again, and something stirred in the soil. Crops didn't thrive, but they lived. Stalks stood straight, wheat heads formed, grapes swelled green. The harvests were not abundant, but they were harvests nonetheless. For the first time in years, people could imagine a season that wasn't swallowed by hunger. And yet, they did not rejoice, because recovery is not the same as healing. The scars were deep, not just in the land, but in the minds and bodies of those who had survived. They had lived too long in a world where bread was myth and warmth a memory. Those who had seen the fog-shrouded years wore their trauma like cloaks, heavy, silent, ever-present. They walked with the stiffness of people who had spent too many nights in cold beds and had too many mornings burying the ones they loved. In Constantinople, the grain prices finally stabilized. Bread reappeared in the markets, not cheap, not plentiful, but present. The city, which had buckled under famine and plague, began to stir with something resembling normal life. But it was a quieter city now, less sure of itself. Its people moved with caution, as if afraid the sun might change its mind again. Elsewhere, whole generations had vanished. Entire villages had disappeared from maps. Some had been swallowed by forest, others abandoned to rot, their walls crumbling like dried bread. In some regions, children grew up not knowing what a clear summer sky looked like. They were told stories of the sun, of warmth, of colors more vibrant than gray. And they listened with the same awe reserved for fairy tales. And yet, new generations came, born not into darkness, but into the fragile dawn that followed. They inherited lands that had nearly died, and parents who bore the weight of too many lost names. These children were raised on caution, on whispers, on memories of a time when the world itself had gone silent. Culture shifted, songs changed, the stories told at night became darker, stranger. In Europe, the tales of divine punishment and apocalyptic visions found fertile ground. In the East, dynasties reeled from famine and rebellion, reshaping themselves into new forms. Everywhere, faith and fear walked hand in hand. Some scholars believe that the shadow of those years left a permanent imprint on medieval imagination, that the doom and gloom, the obsession with final judgment, the art of suffering carved into stone and scripture, all of it was seeded in the trauma of this lost decade. Because once you've lived through a sunless world, your faith doesn't just change. Your very sense of reality bends. Light is no longer just light. Bread is no longer just bread. Every sunrise feels like a small, improbable miracle. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of the year 536 and the years that followed. Not just what it took from the world, but what it left behind in the minds of those who somehow kept walking through the fog. It was not the end of the world, but for many, it might as well have been. For centuries, the darkness of 536 lived on not just in chronicles and oral traditions, but in the silence that followed. There was no clear explanation, no satisfying conclusion, just a world that had gone dim, grown cold, and left millions in suffering. Ancient scribes recorded what they saw: the twilight skies, the failed crops, the rivers gone dry. But they never knew why. And after a while, no one asked. The trauma became myth. The memories frayed. The disaster turned into rumor, into curse, into divine warning. Some said it was punishment for pride. Others said it was sorcery. A few even wondered if the world had reached its end, and then simply continued out of spite. It wasn't until nearly 1,500 years later that the truth began to rise. Not from the earth, but from beneath the ice. In the 20th century, scientists started drilling deep into glaciers, pulling out long cylinders of frozen time, each layer a year preserved in snow and silence. What they found changed everything: Greenland, Antarctica. Deep within these ancient ice cores, researchers uncovered unmistakable spikes in sulfur and ash, all dated precisely to 536, and again in 540, and once more in 547. A trilogy of eruptions, a pattern of catastrophe, proof that something enormous and violent had indeed cloaked the world in shadow. The likely culprit: volcanoes. Not just one, but several. Some scientists point to Iceland, others to Central America, Indonesia, or Alaska. It could have been a chain reaction, or a pair of unrelated titans waking at the same moment in history. The ash from these eruptions had entered the stratosphere, the layer of atmosphere so high that normal weather could not wash it away. There, it hung suspended, like a thin grey curtain pulled across the sun. That curtain dimmed light. It filtered heat. It cooled the entire planet by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That may not sound catastrophic to modern ears, but in a world without machines, without global food reserves, without the buffer of industry, it was the difference between life and famine. This was what scientists would later call a volcanic winter, a chilling concept, not because of the temperature alone, but because it revealed something terrifyingly indifferent, that the Earth itself, without warning or malice, could turn against us. And yet the discovery brought not comfort, but discomfort of another kind, because it meant this wasn't divine punishment or demonic sabotage or the sin of an empire. It was simply geology, pressure, molten rock, and an explosion so vast it changed the weather on every continent. It had nothing to do with human affairs. It was a tantrum from a planet we still don't fully understand. More than anything, it reframed the history of the 6th century. The wars, the famines, the plagues, they weren't isolated tragedies. They were dominoes. The sun dims, the crops fail, the people starve. The cities falter, and death follows in waves. Climate, it turned out, didn't just shape weather. It shaped empires, it redrew maps, it changed the course of civilization. And the worst part? It could happen again. Volcanoes still slumber beneath the earth, their mouths sealed by time, but not by peace. We build our cities on their slopes. We fly planes above them. We live our lives beneath a sky that is, in the grand scheme of things, terribly vulnerable. Today we have science. Yes, satellites, climate models, disaster protocols. But if the sun went dim tomorrow, if a supervolcano erupted next year, we would panic all the same. The symptoms would repeat. Crop failures, supply shortages, cold summers, failed harvests. The modern world, for all its power, still dances to the rhythm of a very old drum. We like to think we've mastered nature. But 536 reminds us, nature doesn't care what we think. If anyone still believed, by 537 or 538, that the chaos was confined to one corner of the earth, they were wrong. The sun's betrayal knew no borders. The misery of these years was a global equalizer. Whether you lived in a palace or a hovel, on a mountain or beside the sea, the light failed you all the same. In China, the empire stared upward and found no guidance in the heavens. The Northern Wei dynasty, already fragile, buckled beneath the weight of something even emperors could not command: the weather. Summer snowfall fell across fields that had once nourished millions. Crops failed again and again, not because of war or poor planning, but because the sky no longer understood the cow. With no food, the people rebelled. Desperation always has a spark, and this time it came in the form of strange snow in July and dust storms in spring. Rituals were offered, prayers shouted skyward, but the heavens, whatever gods dwelled there, were silent. In the end, even the dynasty itself collapsed, brought down not by armies, but by frost thousands of miles to the west. Ireland felt the chill too. Monks, forever scribbling in the margins of history, wrote of failure of bread. A quiet phrase, almost poetic, but between the lines it meant this: fields stripped bare, bellies bloated with hunger, prayers whispered over children who would not wake again. No wheat, no oats, no porridge, just silence. The Irish landscape, already harsh, became a place of starvation and sorrow. Villages shrank, trade vanished, livestock were slaughtered early, or stolen, or simply died. There were no relief caravans, no foreign aid, only cold rain, grey skies, and the unyielding grind of time. And then there was Scandinavia, but Scandinavia did not burn, did not starve, did not cry out in scripture or verse. Scandinavia disappeared, not in fire or violence, but in something far more haunting: silence. The evidence lies in trees. Their rings, nature's diary, show a sudden thinning. Growth halted. Forests paused, as though even the pines knew it was wiser not to grow that year. Archaeological records echo this quiet disappearance. Settlements fade from the record. Farmsteads go abandoned. Human activity drops off sharply. People didn't die loudly. They left, or they simply gave up. It was as if the North had decided, all at once, to step off the stage of history for a time. Some historians speculate that this trauma, this long, frozen silence, planted the seeds for what would become Norse culture. That the myths of cruel winters and grim gods, of fated deaths and endless struggle, weren't just metaphor. They were memory. Distorted, yes, but rooted in something real, in a world that once truly went dark. So while the Chinese starved and the Irish prayed, the Norse vanished into snow and story. But the suffering was far from over, because south of all this, in the heart of the mighty Byzantine Empire, the darkness was about to invite a new companion. A plague. In the year 541, just as the world was beginning to remember light, something darker arrived, not in the sky, not in the soil, but in the bloodstream. It came by ship, it always does. Grain shipments arriving in the port of Constantinople carried not just food, but fleas. And not just any fleas, but fleas infected with a microbe so vicious it would come to define terror for centuries. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. The timing could not have been worse. The empire had barely begun to recover from the ash and famine. The sun still struggled to pierce through clouds that had overstayed their welcome. The fields were only just beginning to yield life again. And into this exhausted, half-starved population came a sickness so swift, so brutal, it seemed like death incarnate had taken a personal interest in the city. At first, it was whispers. A merchant died suddenly, a dock worker collapsed mid-shout, then the pattern emerged. Fever, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes, death, sometimes in days, sometimes in hours. Whole households gone by mourning. Priests ran out of prayers, grave diggers could not keep pace. In Constantinople, the air turned sour, the streets filled with bodies. Mass graves became common. The wails of the living were joined by the silence of the dead. And the worst part, no one knew what it was. No one knew how it spread. Was it the breath of God, the punishment of sin, the rot of the earth itself? The emperor, Justinian, who had once dreamed of restoring the glory of Rome, now faced something far more personal. He caught the plague. He burned with fever. His body swelled and twisted. His court prepared for his death. But he survived. He lived, though many of his ministers did not. His army suffered. His bureaucracy withered. His conquests stalled. The man who had once commanded legions now ruled a city half-emptied by death. And across the empire, the plague spread. Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, cities that had already been humbled by famine now burned with fever. The roads became corridors of the dying. Villages vanished overnight. In some places, the population fell by half. In others, there were no survivors left to count. This was not just an outbreak. This was a collapse. To the people of the 6th century, it was the final insult. First, the sun disappeared. Then the crops failed. Then the cold came. And now, death itself had grown impatient. It no longer waited for age or injury. It walked the streets freely, invisible and unstoppable. And yet, people tried to understand. The religious called for repentance. The fearful turned to saints. The desperate blamed the usual suspects. Foreigners, heretics, the poor. But nothing stopped the dying. Nothing. It was as if the planet had grown tired of its guests and was clearing house. Even after the plague receded, it left behind a world permanently altered. Cities would take generations to rebuild. Economies would never fully recover. The Roman Empire, already split and weakened, would never again be the same. And the people, those who lived through both the ash and the plague, were marked forever. They weren't the same. How could they be? When the sky betrays you, the land abandons you, and death takes your neighbors in silence, faith becomes fragile, and history bends. The 6th century was not just an era of loss, it was a turning point, and it began with a sun that simply stopped shining. If you lived through those years, not as a ruler, not as a general, not as a historian, but as a nameless soul in a village the world would never record, your experience was not measured in politics or plague curves. It was measured in how many days the fire stayed lit, how many meals you could stretch from the scraps left in a cracked clay bowl, how many neighbors still answered when you called across the field. Survival wasn't glorious. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, harsh, monotonous. You woke up not to birdsong or the comfort of sunrise, but to grayness. Endless, soft grayness that blurred morning into dusk, that dulled the edges of time until you no longer cared what day it was. You fed the chickens, or tried to, but they had stopped laying. The cow, if you still had one, gave sour milk. Your children coughed more than they spoke. And the stew, always the stew, had begun to taste more like water and memory than anything real. The famine wasn't a thunderclap. It was a creeping shadow. It slipped through the cracks of routine, hollowed out the middle of every day, every plan, every body. People didn't starve all at once. They withered, they faded. In the cities, the rich grew lean. In the villages, the poor disappeared. A neighbor you'd known for years might be found still in their bed, eyes open, unmoving. Or perhaps they simply walked into the woods one day, chasing the sound of something that wasn't there. And then there were the rumors. You heard stories of other towns where the sun had returned, where bread was baked again, where the rivers still flowed and the trees bore fruit. You wanted to believe. You had to. But every time someone left in search of those fabled places, they never came back. Maybe they found paradise. Maybe they found nothing at all. Religion offered some comfort, but not for all. The sermons grew louder, more desperate. Was this punishment? A test? A reckoning? Some priests said the end times had come. Others urged patience and prayer, but prayer didn't fill bowls, and patience didn't thaw frozen soil. The social fabric, already threadbare, began to fray. What justice was there in a world where babies starved before their first word? What law mattered when coins were worthless and grain was salvation? If someone had food, they became a target. If they had none, they became invisible. Stealing became survival. Violence became common, and morality became relative. A loaf of bread could provoke a killing. A rumor of grain could spark a riot. People stopped trusting each other. Even family ties strained under the weight of hunger. And yet, somehow, life continued. Children were still born, fires were still lit, crops, occasionally, sprouted, and when they did, entire communities gathered in awe around the first green shoots, treating them like miracles. A single carrot could bring tears, a potato could mean a future. That's what life in 536 and the years that followed became. Not thriving, not even hoping, just enduring. Like the stones, the trees, the few stubborn animals who hadn't yet given up. And if you made it through, if your hands still worked, if your legs still carried you to water, if your stomach still growled instead of shrank, you were not just lucky, you were a survivor. And in that world, survival meant everything. Civilizations do not collapse with a bang. Not usually. They do not scream as they fall. They do not topple like statues in a square. Instead, they wither. One frayed rope, one missing scribe, one broken law at a time. By the late 530s, the worst of the famine still hung in the air like the ash that had once covered the sky. But now, it wasn't just about food. It was about structure, about all the invisible agreements that held society together. The rhythms of work, the hierarchies of class, the relationships between those who commanded and those who obeyed. And all of it was beginning to unravel. Labor systems, already fragile in the best of times, buckled. Fields went untended not because people were lazy, but because they were gone, dead, fled, lost to sickness, lost to starvation, or simply too weak to swing a scythe or plant a seed. Landowners, used to commanding armies of peasants, now found themselves alone, staring at acres of useless dirt.
Coinage lost its value. It meant nothing if it couldn't buy bread. Some tried to hoard wealth, others tried to tax more. But what good is a silver coin when your people are burning chairs for warmth and chewing bark for food? Trade slowed to a crawl. What caravans still moved did so under heavy guard if they moved at all. Roads fell into disrepair. Markets shrank. Even the cities, those ancient engines of commerce and culture, began to empty. The rural poor streamed toward them looking for food, and when they found none, they stayed anyway, becoming a new kind of problem no one knew how to solve. Justice became unpredictable. In some places, the law was enforced with sword and sermon. In others, it vanished altogether. You could steal a loaf and be blessed or killed, depending on the mood of the nearest authority if there was one. The rules no longer applied equally, and often they no longer applied at all. The aristocracy, once clothed in fine robes and confident arrogance, showed cracks. Some clung to power by force. Others disappeared, into exile, into seclusion, into death. There were lords who raised taxes in the middle of the famine, thinking they could squeeze gold from bones. And there were lords who fled their estates entirely, leaving the peasants to rule themselves or fight over what remained. And fight they did. Violence rose not in grand battles but in small, brutal ways. A stolen chicken led to a stabbing. A rumor of hidden grain led to arson. Neighbors who once shared a fence now shared only suspicion. If someone had food, they were both blessed and cursed. Blessed because they might see tomorrow. Cursed because someone else might take that hope from them in the night. Religious institutions were pulled in every direction. Some became sanctuaries. Priests handed out grain from dwindling stores, offered warmth, comfort, ritual. Others became targets of resentment, symbols of divine failure, of a God who had gone silent. There were those who used the famine to tighten control, to demand repentance, to declare this suffering as a judgment. And then there were the radicals, the ones who walked into the woods and came out prophets, claiming the end was near and salvation only possible if you followed them into darkness. And while all of this churned on the ground, the sky remained quiet. There were no proclamations from above, no bright days to ease the panic, no firm answer to the question that haunted everyone from emperor to beggar: was this temporary, or had the world simply changed? Because it didn't feel like a storm anymore. It felt like a transition, as if the old world, the one with predictable seasons, predictable harvests, predictable laws, had died quietly and something colder had taken its place. And still people held on. They planted again. They watched the sky. They taught their children what little they remembered. They whispered stories of the sun that once warmed them, of the rains that once came on time. But in their hearts, they knew. The world they had inherited was not the one they were born into. And it was not finished unraveling yet. Not every collapse is loud. Some do not burn. Some do not shatter. Some simply vanish. By the early 540s, there were places in the world where people had once lived and now they didn't. Not because of war, not because of invasion, but because they had quietly given up. Fields grew wild. Wells dried or filled with debris. Tools rusted in doorways no one passed through anymore. Footpaths faded under moss. And no one wrote it down. There were no declarations, no mourning songs, just absence. Entire communities erased not by violence but by attrition. The wind passed through open windows. The forest crept back. And the land, always patient, began to forget the shape of the people who once lived there. The records that survived speak of abandonment, of roads untended, of temples unguarded, of granaries never reopened. And yet no chronicler could say where everyone had gone. They had not migrated en masse. They had not vanished into myth. They had simply stopped. And in that vacuum something else grew: rumor. Without communication, without central authority, without news that stretched beyond the next hill, the world began to fill in the gaps with imagination. Stories of distant lands where the sun had returned. Tales of cities untouched by famine. Myths of golden harvests just beyond the mountains, or of whole regions wiped clean by divine fury. Every village had its own explanation. Every elder had their version of why. But no one had certainty. Even the geography began to blur. There were towns marked on maps that no longer existed, bridges that led to silence, temples half buried in dust, trade routes that hadn't seen merchants in years. And still people kept fleeing, searching. From hills to coastlines, from forests to city gates, survivors moved like shadows. They weren't refugees of war. They were refugees of confusion, looking for food, looking for light, looking for a place where the world still worked the way it was supposed to. But few found it. And in their place, the wilderness returned. Roads cracked, crops went untended, churches stood empty save for the birds nesting in their rafters. Even the language began to change. Without consistent contact between towns, dialects fractured. A man might leave his village and walk for 3 days, only to find the people at the other end barely understood his words. It was as if time itself had come undone. And through it all, the people who remained developed a new relationship with the land, not one of mastery but of suspicion. Nature was no longer something to be trusted. It was unpredictable, disloyal. The sun, once a symbol of faith and order, had shown it could disappear without warning. The earth, once generous, had shown it could withdraw its gifts for years. That kind of betrayal does not leave quickly. And so, even as the skies slowly brightened and the ash began to fade from the upper air, the scars remained. Not just on the fields, not just in the bodies, but in the minds of everyone who had survived. The trauma was generational. Children raised during the long twilight had no memory of normal. For them, short summers and lean winters were simply how life worked. They learned to mistrust abundance, to prepare for absence, and to listen carefully when the wind changed. Because deep down, they feared the silence would return, and next time it might not leave. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, had always been a place of contradictions. Ancient and new, holy and political, fragile yet enduring. And at its glittering center stood Constantinople, a city of domes and walls and marble dreams. A city that believed itself eternal. In the early 6th century, no one believed that more than Emperor Justinian. He was a man of ambition, vision, and relentless energy. He had codified Roman law into a unified body of civil code, corpus juris civilis, the backbone of many modern legal systems today. He had built the Hagia Sophia, a church so vast and luminous that people swore it was built not by hands, but by angels. He had waged war across the Mediterranean, reclaiming former Roman provinces like a man flipping through an old family album and demanding his inheritance. To Justinian, history was not something you recorded. It was something you reclaimed. But history, it turned out, had other plans. First came the darkness, the dimming sun, the gray skies, the strange weather. Harvests in Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, began to fail. And with that failure came famine. Bread prices in Constantinople soared. People rioted, then begged, then starved. The capital, once a marketplace of silks and spices, began to feel like a city under siege. Not by armies, but by absence. Absence of grain, absence of warmth, absence of certainty. Justinian, ever devout, doubled down. He built more churches, funded religious processions, offered prayers. Perhaps he thought that by displaying his piety, he could bend the divine back in his favor. That God, seeing his devotion, would restore the light. But if the heavens were watching, they did not respond. Then, as if the sunless skies and empty fields weren't enough, the plague arrived. It didn't knock. It didn't announce itself with fire or thunder. It came by sea, tucked inside the fur of rats and the bellies of fleas. It arrived in the shadows and took root in the lungs. And once it began, it did not stop. The plague tore through Constantinople like a flame through dry parchment. It struck fast, without pattern or mercy. Priests, guards, senators, bakers, all equal in the eyes of infection. Fever, swelling, delirium, death, streets filled with bodies, churches with prayers, graves with names, then no names at all. Justinian himself fell ill. The emperor, the man who dreamed of Rome's second coming, was bedridden, his body racked with the same black swellings as the common man. He survived, but his empire did not come out whole. The government cracked. The bureaucracy collapsed. Military campaigns faltered. The people, once proud citizens of a divine empire, now wandered the streets like ghosts, hungry, afraid, and surrounded by the scent of rot. And worse, they began to wonder if even Justinian, God's chosen ruler, could not protect the empire, then who could? Across the provinces, local governors struggled to keep order. Some abandoned their posts, others ruled with cruelty. Trade routes dried up, laws were forgotten. The dream of a reborn Roman world had slipped into nightmare. And Justinian, the man who had once reached for glory, now ruled over a broken mirror. The Byzantines had survived invasions, civil wars, political betrayal. But this was different. You cannot negotiate with a sun that won't rise. You cannot bribe a plague. And yet the empire endured, not as Justinian had imagined it, proud, unified, triumphant, but as something smaller, grayer, a version of itself that walked with a limp. That, perhaps, is the legacy of the disaster. Not that it destroyed the empire, but that it humiliated it. That it reminded even the most powerful rulers in the most fortified cities with the grandest cathedrals and the holiest relics, that when the earth decides to silence the sun, all human ambition becomes a whisper in the dark. By the time the skies began to clear, by the time the last ash drifted down, and the sun tentatively returned to its post in the heavens, something else had already settled in its place: silence. Not the silence of a peaceful morning or a prayer in a church, but the silence of absence. Entire villages had vanished. Languages had shifted. Children had grown up never knowing a summer without frost. The world had not ended. But the world that had been that familiar, rhythmic, seasonal world was gone. And the people who survived, they were not the same. Time had changed for them. Without sunlight to mark the hours, without harvests to break the year, the passage of time became strange. Days bled into weeks. Weeks blurred into seasons that no longer made sense. Morning and evening were just shades of gray. People lived moment to moment, not in years, not in dreams, but in survival. If you had made it to this point through the sunless years, the failed crops, the plague, you were not whole. You were not triumphant. You were scarred, malnourished, haunted, and alive. That was enough. The sun returned, not all at once and not brightly. Its light was timid, pale at first, like someone returning from a long illness. The first time a shadow reappeared on the ground, people paused, looked down, and wept. Not because it was beautiful, but because it had been gone so long they'd forgotten what it looked like. The earth began to grow again. Crops didn't thrive, but they survived. The soil, once cold and defiant, began to yield once more. Rivers ran clear. Birds sang again carefully. And slowly, painfully, the machinery of civilization lurched forward. But people lived differently now. They looked at the sky with suspicion. They planted with caution. They stored more than they needed, not because they were greedy, but because they remembered. Hope, once a daily companion, had become something else, a guarded thing, wrapped in layers of fear. And through it all they told stories. Of the years without bread, of the stars that appeared at noon, of the sun that forgot to rise. These stories passed from parent to child, changing over time, growing into myth. And though the names of the emperors faded, and the chronicles were lost or misread, the memory remained in superstition, in ritual, in the deep, bone-level caution of communities that had once watched the world itself forget how to live. Today we know what they didn't: that it was a volcanic winter, that the sky dimmed because the earth had erupted, that it was not punishment but physics, not wrath but geology. But knowing doesn't erase what they endured. It doesn't bring back the fields. It doesn't resurrect the nameless dead. It doesn't warm the gray years. All it gives us is this: a glimpse into a time when everything humanity relied upon, sun, sky, warmth, food, time, even hope, was taken away. And yet they endured, quietly, painfully, without knowing why. They endured. And that, perhaps, is what makes 536 the most haunting year in human history. Not just for the ash, not just for the cold, not just for the plague, but because the people who lived through it did not have the comfort of explanation. They simply woke up day after gray day and carried on, because there was no other choice.